Well, I've been rolling around in my head when I was going to do this video. This will be my first video. And since the Paris attacks, I've been trying to come to grips with what I've been seeing from the liberals and from the regressives themselves. And then, yesterday, in my adopted state of Texas, I saw something that was really disconcerting. A group of armed goons had surrounded a mosque and were chanting against Islam. And all I can think is, after reading the book by Majid Nawaz and Sam Harris on Islam and the future of tolerance, all I could think was how liberals, like me, I consider myself, at least I used to consider myself to be one, bear some responsibility for this. And when you're being told things like this by the president,
ISIL is not Islamic.
And you refuse to accept the fact that ISIS is Islamic.
Because I know that's the popular version of what went on there. I know a lot of people like to believe that. I wish I could, but I was there. I wasn't here in a classroom, hoping I was right, thinking about it. I was up to my knees in rice paddies with guns, and then we're going up against Charlie, slugging it out with him, while pussies like you were back here partying, putting headbands on, doing drugs, listening to the goddamn Beatle albums. Oh! Oh!
First of all, if someone self-identified as a pansexual ethereal werewolf, you would say that has to be something we have to identify them as. ISIS says they are Islamic. They are led by an Islamic scholar, al-Baghdadi. They're Islamic. They take Islamic teachings from the Quran and Hadith as their code. And they aren't extremists. ISIS are fundamentalists. They're practicing the very fundamentals of Islam as instructed in their dogma. In the face of all these facts, you still refuse to believe that they are Islam. That they are Muslims. And the Muslims who deny that they are Muslim are part of the problem as well. So in the face of all these facts, you've held more tightly to your religious ideology of identity politics than accepting the thing that's obvious to everyone else, that these people are Muslim. It's obvious to everybody, including most of the Muslims trapped in these Islamist hellholes, like the Levant, where ISIS is now. After the Paris attacks, liberals failed. They failed the world. You failed to host a reasoned and academic criticism of the very thing that was obvious to everyone else. You created a vacuum. And what have we learned from ISIS and Iraq? We have learned that when you have a power vacuum or an empty space in the conversation, it will be filled by the first person to get there. And Al-Qaeda in Iraq was already there. They rebranded themselves and became ISIS. So by failing to provide a context in which we could go at this problem academically, you have ceded the argument to the far extremes of both sides. You've ceded the argument to emotion instead of reason and logic. By not providing a reasoned and academic outlet for outrage, you have allowed the right wing in our country, the right wing zealots in our country, to capture and harness the outrage that was obvious to everyone else about who did this and who's responsible for these attacks and who's responsible for these repeated attacks. I mean, just look at the ones we've had recently. Paris, Beirut, Mali, don't forget Ankara in Turkey, and then a place where I was, 2009 at Fort Hood. That was an Islamist attack as well. Chattanooga recruiting station. Let's not forget those. So now we have allowed, by the liberals ceding the argument and not wanting to address the obvious, they've ceded this argument to the maniacs on both sides. So now they have mounted, the right wing in our country has mounted this horse of hatred, and they're riding it like hellfire through the country. Since you can't state the obvious and address the obvious, that Islam and Islam has an Islamism and a jihad problem, people are right not to trust you. No one's going to trust you in the conversation if you can't trust what's right. This is what Majid Nawaz calls the Voldemort effect, where in Harry Potter you cannot name the scary monster. The scary monster must remain unnamed at all times. He who we will not name. This is what you're doing with Islamism and jihad, and that's Majid Nawaz, who coined that term. A former Islamist who spent 5 or 6 years in a Egyptian prison for plotting Islamist attacks, came back out and said, you know what, this isn't right what we're doing. And it's odd to me that you'd be willing to let, in these identity politics, you'd be willing to let more gays be thrown off roofs. You'd be willing to let more women be stoned for being raped, all to avoid an uncomfortable conversation we have to have with Muslims in this country and across the world. This is about 20% of Islam we're dealing with if you look at the Pew Research polls. So it's not all, of course, not all of them. But let's put this in perspective. If 20%, and I don't know the numbers on Mormonism, but if 20% of Mormons in the United States were dedicated to the idea and held firmly in the belief that they could establish a new Garden of Eden here in the United States, and they could do so using violence and military action to subvert the United States population, and they started doing that, we would be invading Utah like right fucking now. And if they were throwing gays off roofs in Provo, we would go in and stop it, which shows the difference between our two cultures, the cultures that we're talking about. The culture of Muslim extremists and Arab Islamists and the governments and assholes that support them on that side of the country in the East, on that side of the world, and our country, civilized and secular in the West. So in your rush to blame everybody but the people responsible, and the ideology that's primarily responsible and only responsible for all these attacks, it's not United States intervention in the Middle East. Well, that is provided a background for these, for places like groups like Al Qaeda in Iraq and ISIS to evolve. It's not the primary reason that they exist. This is simply a fundamental expression of the fundamental beliefs written down in their religious dogma. You have failed as liberals. Something we do is protect the oppressed, right? So what we have failed to do, and I say you and we, and I keep switching back and forth because I'm not even sure if I'm a liberal anymore, because I can't agree with the stances you're taking on a lot of these issues. You have done nothing to protect, who are the people who are the moderates, the people who are the oppressed, the secularists, the people who believe in a strong centralized government that protects all people and provides rights to all people. You've alienated them as well. So the moderates and possible reformers of the death cult ideology that now dominates that part of the world in the Middle East have been left hanging. So now with your failure, the conversation is dominated by two sets of assholes. It's our assholes on one side with their religious dogma and somewhat correct xenophobia, and their assholes on the other side that hate everybody and want to kill everyone and establish a worldwide caliphate. And there's two sets of assholes screaming over everyone else, over the top of everyone else, to yell at each other, to make threats at each other. And the problem with assholes is they all stink and they're all full of shit.